We're back for another Fireside Fire Drill, and I really appreciate you joining us. Do you know that some 300,000 people watched us last Friday? Almost 300 new people signed up to volunteer in the past 2 weeks. And what this means is a total of 1.9 million people tuned in since May across all platforms. Thank you so much for being part of this community and for taking action with me. You know, just knowing how many engaged, passionate people there are out there, all fighting for a just and sustainable world together, it just makes me so hopeful. And you know what else fills me with hope? Fire Drill Fridays and Greenpeace have launched, as I've said before, a massive electoral organizing program to ensure that we elect climate champions up and down the ballot. And we need your help. We're building a very large voter contact team. I mean, I'm talking thousands of people. First, to identify climate voters within critical races throughout the country. And then we need your help texting them to make sure they actually turn out and vote. We're re-registering voters who've been purged from the polls. That's really critical. And for those of you who don't mind making phone calls, we need you to reach out to voters across the country and have persuasive telephone call conversations with them. You're going to be receiving training for this, don't worry. You're not going to be on your own. You're getting training and you can do it right from your homes. And, you know, we follow the science when it comes to best practices. Postcard writing has been shown to make a significant difference if it's done the right way. So we're talking about sending postcards to undecided voters, to just tip them over the edge so that they will decide, and to friends, and also sending postcards as a follow-up to phone calls or texts that you've sent. So we're recruiting for that too. And don't worry, you'll get the postcards, you'll get addresses, and you'll get some ideas about what to say. You're not going to be on your own. We also have a team of dedicated Latinx and constituency organizers who'll be working around the clock to ensure we engage and turn out Latinx voters in November. So if you speak Spanish, we need you. Please sign up. And that means going to firedrillfridays.com/volunteers. And you can sign up there so our organizers know how to reach you and get you plugged in. You know, one of the things about joining us, besides the fact that it really helps us achieve our goals, you become part of a community, and that feels good. And also, the people that you're going to be working with when you volunteer are the most unbelievable, top-notch experienced organizers. I'm just so thrilled and impressed to be working with them. And so you know, in a way, you're going to be learning about organizing, and some of you may decide to become organizers. And some of you may find yourselves in leadership roles as Greenpeace, US, and Fire Drill Fridays gear up for November. We need our leaders. And something, well, we're dedicating this Friday to go back to a major focus on the ultimate central culprit, fossil fuels. And something really unprecedented happened in late April. Because cars and buses and trains and planes were idling, oil futures went negative for the first time in history. Fossil fuels were a shaky investment even before COVID-19. It was just because of taxpayers' multi-billion-dollar subsidies, because of that they appeared to be profitable, but they weren't. But with the shutdown caused by COVID-19, by the pandemic, storage facilities and offshore oil tankers were full up with nowhere to go. Oil companies were paying people to take their oil and get it off their hands. And it became blindingly clear to everybody what many climate experts and economists have known for quite a while. The fossil fuel industry is a bad bet for long-term job and economic security. Well before COVID-19, their stocks appeared to be in permanent decline. During 8 of the last years, oil and gas stocks underperformed the broader market, while last year renewable stocks outperformed the index by 20%. With the general economic crisis we're seeing because of the pandemic, we have to pay careful attention to how our government, both the current one and the one that'll be in place in 2021, how that government intends to put our country back together. Why would we ever want to rebuild our energy sector based on a crumbling foundation represented by the fossil fuel industry? I mean, why would we bet on a losing industry that could lock us into more global warming when we could invest that money in the clean, renewable industries that create more jobs per dollar invested and provide less expensive energy to customers? But that's exactly what the Trump administration is trying to do, while ignoring the renewable energy sector that's lost thousands of jobs during the pandemic. The Trump administration's granted immediate relief to the fossil fuel sector, the very industry that's driving climate change. It bought $3 billion of oil and gas for its strategic petroleum reserve in a move that was possibly illegal. $50 million of the funds that were meant to go to small businesses to continue paying their employees, and it was supposed to go to local governments and counties, and instead it went to the fossil fuel companies, along with $1.5 billion in no strings attached tax benefits. And that's just what we know about, because so much of what's happened with the COVID relief funds hasn't been transparent. And, you know, we know from our indigenous friends that the Trump administration has taken advantage of the pandemic to fast track a number of controversial fossil fuel projects on their lands, because they know that protesting is going to be hard during the pandemic. You know, for example, Winona LaDuke and her people in northern Minnesota have been fighting the Enbridge No. 3 pipeline. They've fought it to a standstill. All the pipes are there, but there's been no digging. The pipes haven't been put into the ground. Well, workers from that pipeline have started to arrive in Minnesota, and they're going to start working on the pipeline now. And Winona said that having them all arriving like that during the pandemic felt like the time when the smallpox infested blankets were sent in to the settlements by European settlers, colonists in the 18th century. That was one of the ways that the Europeans were trying to exterminate the country's original inhabitants. You know, so during a pandemic, the government is sending in all these workers into these rural areas to go ahead with the pipeline project. And the administration has granted the fossil fuel industry indemnity from lawsuits, and it's rolling back all kinds of environmental protections that the industry objects to. You know, our government subsidizes the fossil fuel sector every year with $20 billion plus tax breaks, okay? 45% of existing drilling and fracking wouldn't be profitable without government support. That's what corporate socialism looks like. Have you noticed how quick the right wing is to label things like the Green New Deal or health insurance for all as socialist? But they don't say anything about the billions of our taxpayers' money that subsidizes industrial agriculture and the fossil fuel industry. It's the hypocrisy of the 1%, right? One thing that's happening all over the country that I want to talk about is coal-fired power plants can't compete anymore in the marketplace with the increasingly less expensive renewables. And so they're moving into wind turbines and solar panels and hydroelectric business, and that's good. But they're also and mainly moving from coal into natural gas, and then they call themselves green. Now, you know, there are plenty of politicians and even some environmental organizations that think that frack gas, you know, is not so harmful to the environment, and they call it a bridge energy, that it's the bridge energy that'll take us from now to some future time when solar and wind will be reliable. President Obama was one of those politicians. He gave so many permits to fracked gas. But scientists and most environmentalists point out that replacing coal with gas won't cut emissions nearly enough, and certainly not in time. You know, for one thing, methane gas is extremely potent when released into the atmosphere. Its global warming effect is 87 times higher than CO2 over a 20-year period. And serious methane leaks are a constant problem with gas, both during production, the processing, the transportation, and storage of gas. Gas, well, you probably know this, but it's produced through fracking. And the fracking itself causes all kinds of pollution, even beyond the methane leaks. These include habitat destruction and health risks for communities, groundwater contamination, excessive water consumption at a time when water is becoming so scarce. It causes air pollution, toxic chemical exposure, and increased seismic activity. There are 1,800 studies showing how fracking affects health. The studies show that people of color and low-income communities are hit first and worst. And that means they suffer things like birth defects and childhood leukemia and heart attacks, strokes, preterm births. It means that fracking is the leading cause of disability in this nation, according to biologist Sandra Steingraber. So both because of the climate crisis and its impacts on human health, it's absolutely critical to stop building new gas infrastructure. A transition to renewables becomes so much harder when it means closing down ahead of their economic lifespan newly built multi-billion-dollar gas infrastructures that are designed to operate for decades. We have to insist on a divorce between our government and fossil fuels, the unholy trinity of oil, coal, and gas. We have to arrange a marriage with the safe, clean, beautiful, forever democratic sources of energy. That's our job, and we have to move fast. Now, I'm going to introduce my guest who can help us understand how to arrange this marriage. But before I do, let me give you our good news for the week, okay? Last week, Spain made a historic climate announcement. They're phasing out all coal plants across the country. Greenpeace Spain and allies have been demanding a full phase out by 2025. And this announcement sets Spain on a full track to meet or even beat that deadline. And there'll be no coal plants in operation in Spain anymore. I mean, one company had been holding out, but the high cost of coal electricity compared to any other form of power generation, and in particular, the sharp decline in renewable energy costs made them change their mind. This is a massive victory, 30 years in the making. And we applaud our colleagues at Greenpeace Spain and the many activists behind this incredible win. Yay! Now, the woman that I'm going to introduce you to, our incredible guest, is at the forefront of driving the transition off of fossil fuels. Her name is Rebecca Concepcion Apostol, and she is U.S. Program Director for Oil Change International, spearheading U.S. efforts to keep fossil fuels in the ground, end subsidies and finance for fossil fuels, and work for a just transition to a clean energy system that leaves no one behind. Rebecca, she has over 20 years of organizing and nonprofit management experience. And in the last decade, she's focused on building strong, progressive, and politically active communities of color, working with esteemed organizations, including Planned Parenthood, Appia Vote, and AFL-CIO. Prior to joining Oil Change, Rebecca served as National Organizing Director for Community Outreach Group, LLC, a political consulting firm specializing in canvassing and organizing campaigns for elections and nonprofit advocacy. I'm so happy to welcome you to Fire Drill Fridays, Rebecca. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Jane. I'm so excited to be here with you. Maraming salamat sa inyo. It's an honor to be speaking with you and all of our Fire Drill attendees today. Leading up to our conversation, I've heard so many stories within my activist community, from ages 20 to 70 plus, who have shared stories of joining you on the front lines of many of these fights, from the Philippines all the way to here in the United States. So I just want to say thank you for your leadership, your activism, and lifelong commitment to sharing your platform with all of us so we can bring everyone along in this fight for justice.
Thanks, Rebecca. So for my first question, would you give our viewers an overview of the current state of fossil fuel companies as they hurtle towards bankruptcy? What got us here? What opportunities does this create?
Thanks, Jane. So let's start at what got us here. One of the deep appreciations that I have for this time that we are in is the exposure of the underpinnings and systems of our society that have reinforced the gap to keep the wealthy, and the rest of us without privilege to be able to enact impactful change toward equity. Fossil fuel companies have built their wealth by using privilege and power to exploit resources, forcing communities of color and low wealth communities into high risk conditions. The oil and gas industry continues to profit while people are the ones who suffer the consequences. Communities are made vulnerable from the environmental impacts of oil extraction and exploitation, as well as the magnified impacts of climate change. So what opportunities does this create? Now is the time for us to push hard for policies that will reduce reliance on oil and gas while supporting workers and communities in a transition to clean energy, an equitable and just phase out of fossil fuels. We need progressive policies like a Green New Deal that takes all of these into account. Oil and gas companies were never and are never going to get rid of themselves. In fact, as you mentioned in your opening, they have already invested in extracting more oil and gas than we can afford to burn if we're actually going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But instead of recognizing that reality and planning for a future in which oil and gas reliance must wind down, they've been pulling out all the stops, using their political power to delay the inevitable and keep pumping more and more out of the ground. The capitalist obsession to produce put the industry in oversupply even before COVID-19 hit. In fact, in 2019, its share of S&P 500 stock hit its lowest level in 4 decades. At the time, Jim Cramer of CNBC's Mad Money said fossil fuel stocks were in their death knell phase. The current state of fossil fuel companies is one that my organization, Oil Change International, has been trying to warn people about for a little while. The critical question is not when will it end, but how. COVID-19 has exposed how quickly big shifts can happen and how vulnerable this industry really is. The real question is, will governments manage the decline of the industry quickly enough and in a fair and just way for all of us?
Thanks, Rebecca, for that. We keep hearing about the need to bail out the industry and how many are filing for bankruptcy. If that's the case, why are these CEOs getting massive bonuses when so many Americans are struggling to make ends meet?
Great question. I'm going to take it in 2 parts to help folks understand. So first, regarding the oil price crash. The failure of the fossil fuel industry and our government to face the reality of the decline of oil and gas and the reality of climate change led to a chronically oversupplied oil market. So when that chronically oversupplied market met unprecedented demand destruction caused by the global pandemic, we saw all of the oil prices crash. Many companies had already taken on loads of debt, and so some smaller ones have run out of financing options, leading to bankruptcies. I think it's important to point out, though, Bankruptcy is not the end of a company. What it really is a reorganization of assets so the company can carry on. So what we're seeing is oil and gas CEOs being rewarded bonuses for making it through rough times, rather than seeing that money being invested into managed phase out or the decline of fossil fuels. We're seeing the abuse of such companies, of these millionaire, billionaire CEOs who are paying and putting themselves first, rather than supporting their workforce, rather than paying for their environmental destruction. And honestly, Jane, our government is knowingly allowing it. They're well aware of this cycle. The debt is restructured, the CEOs get fat bonuses, the workforce is laid off. And in 8 to 9 months, it's business as usual. They're up and running again and pumping oil and gas from the ground. To answer the second part of your question, how is this happening in the face of so many Americans that are struggling to make ends meet? We have to look at the structural conditions that have allowed these companies to keep expanding in the face of climate reality. Corrupt politics, racism, and inequality. One opportunity that we have in this time is to really make these linkages and root our responses to the climate crisis in racial and economic justice. We must put people first. As we say in our chants on the streets, bail out people, not polluters. And as we look to recover from the COVID-19 crisis, we have to recognize that certain industries like oil and gas cannot recover to their former state if we're going to create a livable future for us all. The challenge is to push for policies that will turn the industry's current state of unmanaged decline into a just and equitable managed decline that will protect workers, communities, and our climate.
Yeah. Where are our leverage points to turn this moment into a lasting and managed decline?
Luckily, we have a few. Our leverage points in this fight are to push for our government, local, state, and federal, for policies that will ensure a managed decline. And to put it simply, we must fight to keep it in the ground. In February, Oil Change International released a report about New Mexico that revealed over 70% of New Mexico's oil and gas production will come from wells that have not yet been drilled. This undeveloped oil and gas, that's our leverage point. We must continue to fight and show that continued development and expansion of oil and gas is the exact opposite of what we need to be doing. This decade is critical in our being able to lower our climate impact. And expanding production of oil and gas is not what is going to get us there. If we turn this momentum into a lasting and managed decline by pushing our government to enact such policies that will support the health of our communities and support workers into a just transition from fossil fuels to well-paying and secure union jobs. We cannot let the polluters, the fossil fuel industry, off the hook for their actions. Our elected officials must hold them accountable for their destruction. We need to force them to clean up the mess that they've made. Oil and gas companies are legally obligated to pay for cleanup in most states. So we need to see our government step up. We need to see them accelerate polluter pays cleanup in tandem with a stop to new wells and a managed phase out of all extraction. This time is critical to support project level resistance. The wins that we've had in the past weeks, the cancellation of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the court victories of the Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone XL, the delays of expansion of export terminals in Brownsville, Texas, all have been due to local and statewide community organizations pushing the resistance on the ground.
We're trying real hard in California to push the resistance. California, along with Texas, is one of the main oil producing states in this country. And taxpayers in this state are stuck with cleaning up the wells. Our governor, Newsom, just like his predecessor, Jerry Brown, so-called progressive Democrats, they're not forcing, he's not forcing the oil companies to clean up after them, and the communities are left
Yeah.
holding the responsibility. So
Not to
tell
mention,
me,
some allowed 35 new fracking permits to go through since April alone.
I know.
So we've been saying these things, and yet it's still going through like business as usual.
Yeah, we're going to come down real hard. That's how to do it, is to make them sorry. What are some current fights that our viewers should be aware of?
There's actually quite a few happening right now. So even with the downturn in production now and the instability of the industry that we're finding, the Permian Basin in the United States, which is located in Texas and New Mexico, is still projected to grow off the charts over the next decade. And activists like Carrizo Camocrudo in South Texas and Texas are continuing to fight to delay the expansion of export terminals and oil projects that will continue to harm millions of people and permanently change the ecosystem of the area. And the gas liquids that come from the Permian feed into Gulf Coast petrochemicals, where they're trying to build facilities like Formosa Plastics in Louisiana, which is being valiantly fought by Rice St. James. I mentioned New Mexico in the last question, and they're actually currently fighting a proposal by the state's Oil Conservation Commission that would make it easier for companies to use their toxic waste to drill and frack wells. So these new rules would even open the door for the industry's waste to be dumped on the land and discharged into streams, affecting clean water for all. As I said, it's the time to be pushing for project by project cancellations. We got some great court wins, right? If with Keystone XL and Dakota Access Pipeline, but we need to work to make sure that these are permanent victories. And we need to keep supporting those on the ground fighting the remaining project pipelines like Line 3 in Minnesota and Jordan Cove in Oregon. We need to continue to support these communities as they are standing up for their neighbors, their land, and our climate. Last but not least, we are pushing real hard right now in California with leadership from California Environmental Justice Alliance and Vision, the Voices in Solidarity Against Oil in Neighborhoods, as well as in coalition with Last Chance Alliance for the passing of Assembly Bill 345, right, which would have CalGEM establish a minimum setback distance between oil and gas activities and sensitive receptors. So this includes a consideration of a 2,500-foot setback distance for schools and playgrounds. And we need this health and safety buffer zone, as nearly 5.5 Californians, who are mostly people of color, live within just 1 mile of an oil, gas, or well.
Wait a minute, you said 5.5.
Yes, 5.5 million Californians.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Million Californians live within 1 mile of an oil or gas well. And 1 out of 3 of these Californians, so about nearly 2 million, live in areas of the state most burdened by environmental pollution. 92% of Californians living in these heavily burdened neighborhoods are people of color.
Yeah. And
so for Californians tuning in, we urge you to contact your local senators and urge them to push AB 345 to a vote.
You know, I think a lot of people like me are aware of all of the environmental regulations that Trump is rolling back. I mean, some really important regulations. Like last week, one of the most audacious deregulatory actions of the Trump administration, the National Environmental Policy Act, was unilaterally weakened. And so let's just assume that Biden gets elected. To what extent is he going to be able to reverse these rollbacks?
Short answer, yes. Like, you know, he's going to be able to undo a lot of them. And Biden, you know, we've seen some changes in his climate plans emerge as the campaign has continued, and it's very promising. It honestly shows the impact that people power has had on his position, that his climate plan has strengthened. But it's still going to take us holding him accountable to these promises and actually pushing him to go further. That will make the kind of lasting change we need. So thank you for promising to ditch Keystone XL. But really, we should ditch all pipelines because all of them are just as disastrous. And yes, thank you, we should stop leasing on public lands. But we need to phase out the whole fossil fuel industry. He's had some strides toward just transition, but again, it falls short. We really need to push for unionizing the clean energy workforce so that when we do phase out the fossil fuel industry, there are well-paying, secure, union jobs on the other side, so we can stabilize the economic foundation of our local communities. To talk about what he can really do in a new administration, I want to lift up a platform and an action plan supported by over 100 organizations that detail what he can really do. Newly released this week by Demos, with our support at Oil Change US, is the Frontlines Climate Justice Executive Action Platform. And that details a real clear vision of an equitable and resilient social and economic transformation. They focus on environmental justice, just recovery, climate equity, accountability, and energy democracy. And they show how through a series of executive orders, the next president can really set the stage for climate justice with a managed phase out of fossil fuels and just transition, and really establishing low wealth income energy assistance programs to make access to energy efficiency equitable, and by implementing a national safe drinking water action plan. Also in December 2019, which to all of us feels like a lifetime ago, even if it was just 8 months ago, we partnered with the Center of Biological Diversity, and we released the Climate President Action Plan, which listed 10 immediate steps the next administration can take in their first 10 days. They can take it in their first 10 days, and that will help really solve our climate emergency. So I encourage folks to look at these plans and continue to push our local governments, continue to push Biden, continue to push your elected officials who are running for office to really take these types of measures into consideration.
Yeah. And he can do them by executive order, I think. He doesn't need Congress to do those 10 things. That's
Absolutely.
Right. So, that's just to put in our heads for now that if God willing, Biden becomes our next president, starting at the inauguration, we have to bring all the pressure we can possibly bear to force him to do it. And, he may not be the climate champion that a lot of people, especially young activists, were hoping for, but just the way he's moved over the last few months is we need to pay attention to that, because what it shows is he can be pushed, he can be persuaded, and it's up to us to do the pushing and persuading. So let me ask you another question, Rebecca. Utility executives and even some environmentalists acknowledge that renewable energy, they know it's going to continue to grow, but they don't believe that wind turbines and solar panels and batteries can replace natural gas in the near term. They say that wind and solar are too unreliable and storage batteries are too expensive. Is this a justified argument? And if it is, what can be done? And if it's not justified, and in fact, renewables and the batteries to store them can be made quickly and less expensive, what can be done? What should be done? Is that question clear enough?
Yeah. So the power companies aren't justified in saying that wind and turbine is too expensive. To be very honest, a growing number of utilities in the US are actually starting to recognize that even from an economic standpoint, this is what needs to really be done. What they offer up instead of the renewable energy solution is using gas as a bridge fuel. So I want to be really clear to our viewers. Gas as a bridge fuel is a myth. It pollutes just as oil does. It is extracted. and the pipelines developed to export gas are part of what we've been fighting against. The American Petroleum Institute, or API, the trade association for the fossil fuel industry, has been key in lying to consumers about gas for years. They've greenwashed gas to help keep us off of renewables and reliant on fossil fuels for as long as they can. When it comes down to it, wind and solar are already cheaper than fossil fuels for power generation. And batteries are actually quite competitive in many regions, competitively priced in many regions. So adding batteries to wind and solar projects is already proving to be a cost-effective way to enhance, to extend the capacity of these types of projects. Utilities are starting to change their view of this, but they're really beginning to see the technology develop faster than anyone ever dreamed. And it's not just being driven by the technological improvements and economies of scale, but also by customer preference and state legislation. You know, I want to lift up Virginia, for example. In Virginia, we went from zero clean energy to a mandate for zero carbon power generation by 2045. And just recently, Dominion, the state's largest utility, abandoned its plans for a gas pipeline and is gearing up to be one of the country's biggest renewable energy suppliers. So even though renewable energy is now totally cost competitive, we still need renewable energy mandates from our government to force companies to change course. That's the part that's missing. You know, we need that type of coherent government policy to really accelerate the transition beyond what market forces alone can do. And honestly, beyond what the fossil fuel industry wants to do.
And we have to do what Roosevelt did in the 30s too. We also have to demand that when that transition from the fossil fuels to renewables happens, that the workers are paid union wages and benefits, collective bargaining rights, you know, so that they're earning enough to sustain a family, buy a home, send their kids to school. We have to really fight for that too, right?
Yeah, we absolutely do. I mean, we're lucky that at this point, you know, like with Dominion, because they're not building any more gas plants because of the clean energy bill that passes here in Virginia. We need that type of government policy to be replicated in more states. And we need for it to refocus, as you were saying, Jane, on job creation. So things like a Green New Deal, you know, where we can ensure that jobs in the renewable energy sector are well-paying, secure, union jobs. Sadly, the companies aren't going to do it unless we force them to, and unless the government forces them to. So what we really need our government to do is step up, and we need to keep pushing them to do so. You know, you lifted up the work being done in Spain, and that is absolutely possible here in the United States. But we need elected officials who will stand up to the fossil fuel industry, who will recognize climate science and enact policies like a Green New Deal, where we focus on a managed phase out and a just transition for workers and communities. What's missing in this equation is the government policy to support what we know to be the reality. And without these drastic changes, we all understand that we are headed toward catastrophe. So we need politicians to stop taking money from fossil fuel donors. We need them to recognize the unjust political influence that the fossil fuel donors have had for decades. And we need our elected officials to stand up and say enough is enough. We have a few climate champions, but we need more to make the overhauling changes we need. So that's something that honestly all of us can do. You know, we can all urge our local, our state and federal officials to do this. We need to keep telling them, keep it in the ground, stop drilling where we're living. And we need to pressure them into understanding that without this type of sweeping change this decade, because this is what we have this decade,
yeah,
that is what is going to keep us from climate catastrophe.
Yeah. So many well-intentioned people advocate carbon capture and storage. Can you explain the problems inherent with this technology?
Sure. Um, so the first thing I'm going to say is overall, carbon capture and storage is a false solution. I would think of it as the industry saying, yeah, let's add some lipstick on this pig. That way we can retain our control, we can retain our power, and we can retain our wealth. But carbon capture storage is expensive because it requires a huge amount of energy for the capture itself. And it requires the transportation and deep burial of the waste. So projects to date have been hugely subsidized, and there's little progress on actually reducing cost of carbon capture storage. So additionally, it still perpetuates our dependence on dirty fuels that will continue to require mining, will continue to require extracting, processing, transporting. The idea of bioenergy with carbon capture storage, which is called BECCS, would require so much land to be effective, land that's about the size of India. And it would create many more problems than it would solve. We have solutions that we need to rapidly scale up, and public money would be much, much better spent if we spent it on scaling up new energy storage technologies like green hydrogen and et cetera, rather than wasting it on technology that can't be scaled up enough to ever be effective. The real problem with carbon capture storage is that it's presented as a silver bullet, but there is a large variety of technology and ideas under carbon capture storage. There are a few parts of it that have some regenerative focus on communities, but honestly, it's still continued pollution if you aren't actually phasing it out. And as you were saying at the top of the show, carbon capture storage ensures more active government support and subsidization of the industry versus not putting all of our efforts toward a managed phase out and just transition. In any scenario that is brought up, we need to phase out the fossil fuel industry. And pretending that carbon capture storage is the silver bullet that will solve everything is deadly. And we need to protect our communities from further extraction.
So in a way you've answered this, but let me ask anyway. Many oil and gas companies, as you know, are coming out with green or climate friendly plans. Are these plans really helping to solve the climate crisis? And since we know that oil and gas companies aren't going to be the solution we need, where does the solution lie?
So oil and gas companies, the industry has a long, long history of deception when it comes to saying, what they're going to do versus the harm that they're actually causing. And unfortunately, while more and more oil companies are claiming that, they get it, they hear us when it comes to climate, none of their announced plans come close to what's required to keeping warming at 1.5 degrees and avoid ever worsening climate change. And honestly, despite all the claims made, 99.2% of oil and gas company investments into new projects was still flowing into fossil fuels in 2019. So only 0.08% of that was going into these so-called green efforts. So companies like BP and Shell have come out and said that they'll work toward net zero by 2050. But if you actually read their plans, Jane, they're incredibly thin on detail of how they actually plan to do that. And many of them include huge loopholes. Some companies say that they'll invest more in renewable energy or plant lots of trees to make up for continuing to spew pollution. But investing in the good, isn't adequate without a commensurate plan that actually plans to start divesting from the bad. What would actually count, what a real solution would look like, what a real meaningful climate commitment from an oil and gas company would look like is, one, to stop investing in new fossil fuel extraction projects. No company has committed to do this yet. 2, commit to actually declining their oil and gas production within this decade by 2030 at a pace that matches a 1.5 degree warming limit. You know, lastly, another thing to keep front and center of this discussion is the long track record that these companies have of violating the rights of our communities and blocking meaningful climate action. Are these the companies we really want handling our energy transition? No, not at all. We need a different democratic model of managing our energy resources that puts people first. And that puts the onus on our government to really come up with that and support us in doing that.
Well, that leads to my last question very smoothly. You've referenced it, but let's talk explicitly about how racism is connected with climate justice. I mean, we've been focusing a lot of our weekly fireside chats on the intersection of these issues. Can you tell our viewers what it means when we say racial justice is climate justice?
Right. As I said at the top of the hour, fossil fuel companies have built their wealth by using and abusing, really, their privilege and power to exploit resources, forcing communities of color and low wealth communities into high risk conditions. The oil and gas industry continues to profit while people suffer the consequences, and communities are made vulnerable from the environmental impacts of oil extraction and exploitation, as well as the magnified impacts of climate change. And as you mentioned, Jane, studies link proximity to oil and gas wells to increase risk of asthma, other respiratory illnesses, a whole slew of health problems that come with the oil and gas extraction because it produces air toxics and other risks, including water contamination, noise pollution, spills of toxic chemicals, explosions, and all of those things. If we want to get to a place of clean, equitable energy for all, we have to enact those policies that I've been talking about. Government prioritizing and manage phase out, and a just transition for our workers and communities. A Green New Deal to support us all in getting there. We also need to take the time to learn and listen to those who have lived through this experience. You know, those who are on the front lines, that have been most impacted by having oil and gas in their communities, near their schools, and even at times in their backyards. You know, as well as listening to those who have prioritized caring for the land and each other as a part of their practice. I mentioned New Mexico earlier, and when I had the chance to visit New Mexico before all this stuff hit in early February, we held a community teach-in panel. And a Dene organizer on our panel, her name is Kim Smith from Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, or YUCA, reminded us all that we need to, quote, center Indigenous cultures by learning about what already exists. The structures that are not called permaculture, that are called permaculture, are the ways that we Indigenous folks have been living for years, for centuries, really.
Yeah.
As I've said, oil and gas activities disproportionately impact communities of color and low wealth communities. These fights are inextricably linked because those with power and privilege, the fossil fuel industry, and corrupt politicians have made it so. So we need to address this fight from a place that lifts all of us up, where we're all in solidarity working together.
Which the Green New Deal does. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we have about 6 minutes to take questions from the audience, if that's okay with you, Rebecca. Jess, do you have any questions?
We sure do. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Jane. First question is from Justine on Facebook. She asks, how do we prevent the next generation of renewable energy companies from being owned and controlled by big oil? For example, big wind brought to you by Shell, big solar by BP. How do we prevent this?
Great question. Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, what is key to preventing this is really the type of stuff that I was talking about earlier and exposing the lies of the industry itself. Yesterday, I saw the grossest, most horrible, I don't know if it's a TV spot or some ad that was put out by BP. And they said something like, find your inner peace, or where do you find your inner peace? And what they made it look like was two people meditating at the back of a car driving through the countryside, because this is where we're supposed to find peace. And that's the biggest problem. They continue to greenwash their policies. They continue to put it out there that they're for the good of the people. We need to expose that, continue to expose that and lift it up. And we need our government to really step up and put a stop to the greenwashing, put a stop to the fossil fuel industries controlling the future of renewable energies in this country.
So the government could the government demand that a BP, for example, that went into the wind turbine business, that they follow environmental guidelines and pay and allow union organizing in their company? Can the government demand that?
They absolutely can. And not only can they demand it, what's most important is if we're able to get this passed, we have to enforce it.
Yeah.
There are so many loopholes, like you mentioned, the different subsidies that exist within the United States for oil and gas companies as it is. We really need to close those loopholes. We need to stop those subsidies so that we can all make a just transition and a clean transition to renewable energy.
Yeah. One of the people in the chat box says, has the government ever done this on any front? Until dark money is out, I don't think another way needs to be focused on. I think another way needs to be focused on, well, in the 1930s, FDR did it. Mm-hmm. There's no reason why we can't do it. But again, it's why Fire Drill Fridays and so many other environmental organizations, Greenpeace and others, are working so hard, is because this is the time when we need to build people power. Yes. This isn't just kind of, we have nothing else to do, so we kind of get together every Friday. We need to build millions. We need 11 million people in the United States demanding these things. If that happens, it's going to happen no matter what.
Right.
So that's why we need you. We need to build the army.
I really appreciated your point last week that you made on Fireside Chat about getting that tipping point, getting those 11 million people. We need to continue to engage the willing. As long as we continue to lift up the truth, as long as we continue to expose the lies, we can create climate champions in our neighborhoods and hopefully be able to elect climate champions in our local, state, and federal positions.
Yeah. So let's all keep that number in our heads. We're part of the mobilization that's working to get 11 million people in this country to be part of this effort. If each of you gets 10 other people to join us, that's the kind of thing that works. Jess, let's have the next question from the audience. Is there still time? Yeah.
Yes, sure thing. So Delphine on Zoom asks, Rebecca, if you can please cite a first concrete step for ordinary citizens to play a role in putting a stop to further fossil fuel exploration.
Contact your elected officials. Anywhere that you are, this is a fight that you can get into. So many elected officials take money from the fossil fuel industry. Encourage them to stop taking money from them. Encourage them to actually start building plans and policies like the Green New Deal. In some states, the Green New Deal is actually something that's up in state legislatures, and so encourage that type of bill to be put on the floor. As Jane was encouraging folks at the top of the hour, our power, our voices through voting and through contacting our elected officials is huge. So if we can all dedicate ourselves to doing that, bringing 5 friends along with us to do the same, we'll begin to see that impact. And we'll begin to see what it looks like when these elected officials start to listen to us and start to understand and recognize the science behind the climate crisis.
Yeah, Mary Mitchell in our chat box is saying, well, how many people do we have now? Well, just Fire Drill Friday and Greenpeace has 1.5 million people as part of this very community that we're talking to right now over the course of a month or so. So, you know, that leaves us 9.5 million to go. But, you know, there's the Sunrise Movement and there's 350. I mean, there's so many other organizations.
Oil Trade International.
International. So if just we have 1.5 million right here,
Right.
this is doable. It really is doable, but it's, you know, this is real what we're saying to you. We need you to sign up. Somebody else here says, I speak Spanish, you know, what can I do? You can sign up. We need you. People who speak Spanish are invaluable as volunteers because we need to get into the Latinx community and help them understand what's at stake and make sure that they're registered and that they're going to vote. So, you know,
I was going to say folks that speak another language other than English are critical in this moment. You know, here in California, so many of our folks actually don't get their typical news media from English news media. They get it in language, in their home language. That's where they're most comfortable. So if we can have volunteers who speak the same myriad of languages that we see in our country, we can really help make these connections for more folks and encourage them to voice their opinions and show up and vote in these elections.
Yeah. And, you know, intersectionality is a very real thing, and we can see it in the streets all over this country in the last months. I mean, it's unprecedented, the numbers of people that have taken to the streets on behalf of the movement for Black lives. And that crosses age and race and ability and everything. So there are all those millions of people too. I mean, there's reason to be optimistic. But I beg you, join us. Please, please join us. And I'm afraid that we're almost out of time, Rebecca. If you haven't already, please sign up, firedrillfridays.com/volunteer, firedrillfridays.com/volunteer, and sign up. We need you. We really need you. And well, let's see, I have just a few minutes to say that I've written a book about Fire Drill Fridays. It's called What Can I Do? My Path from Climate Despair to Action. I love this book so much. It's coming out September 8th. It's become my textbook. Every chapter is about one of the focuses of the climate crisis. And then it has What Can I Do? It gives you a very practical passage at the end about what you can do as an individual. If you pre-order, it will help us become a bestseller so more people will read it. We've pushed really hard to get this book out before the election. And I've done this video for people who are going to pre-order. So you can pre-order. You can go onto my website, janefonda.com, to pre-order. And maybe on the Fire Drill Fridays site, you can pre-order as well. Thank you, Rebecca. I love you so much. And thank you so much for being with us. And thank all of you at home for joining us. And stay healthy, stay safe, take care of each other. And please join us next Friday. Thanks. Mwah.